The day had arrived, and the excitement on Miguel's face was undeniable. His bright eyes followed every movement on the runway, as if he were watching a perfect choreography. At 17, this was his first major plane trip, and the thrill of flying across the skies kept him alert and full of enthusiasm. Next to him was his Aunt Sophia, a strong and elegant 42-year-old woman, adjusting her glasses and checking some emails on her phone. As a civil rights lawyer, Sophia was used to always being connected to work, but that morning she had promised herself that nothing would interrupt her time with her nephew. Miguel had always been a curious young man, with an insatiable thirst for learning. Ever since he was little, he had dreamed of flying, of being a pilot, and he never stopped studying every detail about planes, routes, and everything related to aviation. So, when his aunt proposed this trip, it was as if the universe had decided to make a dream come true for her. The airport was crowded, but that didn't matter to him. As they walked towards the boarding gate, his excitement was evident. As they moved forward, Miguel observed the other passengers with the typical innocence of youth, not noticing the glances some were giving them. He wore an old denim jacket and worn-out sneakers, his usual attire. For him, it was the most comfortable. But to some eyes, his appearance seemed to tell a different story. Sophia, on the other hand, noticed those glances. It wasn't new to her. As a black woman in a world that constantly underestimated her, she had learned to recognize contempt disguised as politeness or microaggressions hidden behind smiles. She had spent her life fighting against these injustices, but today she wasn't on the defensive. Today, she was there just to enjoy the trip with her nephew. Finally, they boarded the plane. Miguel's excitement kept him restless in his seat, glued to the window. His smile lit up his face as he watched the plane start to fill up. However, as other passengers sat down, Sophia noticed something that began to raise a silent alarm in her mind: the glances again. Some people were looking at them with disgust or curiosity, and a blonde woman with short hair sitting in business class couldn't help but frown as they passed by, even clutching her purse tighter when Miguel walked by. Sophia didn't comment. It was a short flight, and she was used to this kind of situation. They sat in their seats at the back of the plane, far from the privileged area of the business class passengers, and tried to relax. Miguel, however, didn't notice any of this. For him, it was all a wonderful spectacle. Through the window, he saw the wings of the plane, the vehicles passing on the runway, and his excitement grew with every second. However, the tension began to slowly build when a flight attendant, Jessica, a 30-year-old white woman, approached to check the seatbelts and give safety instructions. There was something in her posture that made Sophia uncomfortable. Jessica avoided any kind of eye contact with them, and when she spoke to the other passengers, she did so with a smile that she didn't show them. It wasn't something Miguel noticed right away, but Sophia did. Her years of experience dealing with racism had given her the ability to detect even the subtlest gestures. The plane took off. Miguel was fascinated by the sensation of the aircraft breaking away from the ground and starting to climb. His face was pressed against the window, admiring the clouds that became their landscape. With genuine enthusiasm, he began asking Sophia questions about how the plane worked, how many kilometers it traveled, and how something so big could fly. Sophia, who had always encouraged her nephew's curiosity, tried to answer him as best as she could, but Miguel didn't stop there. He saw Jessica passing through the aisle and decided to ask her directly about how the plane worked. What he expected was a kind response, a small explanation to satisfy his curiosity. What he received was a cold, almost irritated look. Jessica barely stopped. She glanced at him briefly and said something rushed, almost curt, without stopping to explain anything. Miguel's smile faded for a moment, but he still didn't quite understand what was happening. However, Sophia did. Jessica's behavior was a pattern she had seen before. It wasn't just impatience or fatigue. There was something deeper there. Minutes later, Miguel asked another question, this time about flight routes. Jessica, who already seemed to be at the end of her patience, abruptly turned to him and, in a harsh tone, told him he was being disruptive. The word hit like a cold bucket of water. Miguel froze, unable to understand why a simple question could be interpreted that way. His face was pressed against the window, admiring the clouds that had become their scenery. With genuine enthusiasm, he started asking Sophia how the plane worked, how many kilometers it traveled, and how something so big could fly. Sophia, who always encouraged her nephew's curiosity, tried to answer him as best she could, but Miguel didn't stop there. He saw Jessica walking down the aisle and decided to ask her directly about how the plane worked. He expected a kind answer, a small explanation to satisfy his curiosity. What he received was a cold, almost irritated look. Jessica barely stopped. She looked at him briefly and said something rushed, almost curt, without stopping to explain anything. Miguel's smile faded for a moment, but he still didn't fully grasp what was happening. However, Sophia did. Jessica's behavior was a pattern she had seen before. It wasn't just impatience or fatigue. There was something deeper there. Minutes later, Miguel asked another question, this time about flight routes. Jessica, who already seemed to be at the end of her patience, abruptly turned to him and, in a severe tone, told him he was being disruptive. The word hit like a cold bucket of water. Miguel froze, unable to understand why a simple question could be interpreted that way. Sophia intervened immediately, her tone firm but calm. She tried to clarify that Miguel was only asking questions, that he wasn't bothering anyone. But Jessica, with an arrogant attitude, insisted that Miguel's behavior was making other passengers uncomfortable. The murmurs on the plane started to grow, and Sophia felt the situation spiraling out of control. Suddenly, without further explanation, Jessica called one of her colleagues, and without warning, they were asked to leave the flight. Disbelief washed over Miguel. He hadn't done anything wrong, he couldn't understand what was happening. Sophia, however, knew exactly what was going on. She had seen this kind of disguised racism far too many times. She tried to argue, to demand an explanation, but it was all in vain. The plane had come to a halt, and the pressure from the other passengers, many of whom were now watching with curiosity, made the crew insist that they leave. With broken hearts and their heads full of questions, Miguel and Sophia were escorted off the plane. From the tarmac, they watched as the plane doors closed behind them and it took off toward its destination, leaving them behind. Sophia squeezed her nephew's hand and, with a controlled yet firm voice, told him that she wouldn't let this injustice go unpunished. There was a silent storm growing inside her, a determination already taking shape. She knew that this battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sun was setting as Miguel and Sophia returned home, the silence in the taxi ride wrapping around them like a heavy cloak. It was a silence filled with questions, repressed emotions, and, above all, a sense of injustice that Miguel couldn't shake from his mind. His thoughts were flooded with images of the plane, the flight attendant, the passengers watching them indifferently as they were escorted off the flight. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. How had everything gone wrong so quickly? Just an hour earlier, he had been excited for his first flight, and now he sat in the taxi, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the window, not knowing how to process what had happened. Sophia, who usually knew exactly what to say in any situation, also remained silent. It was strange for her, as she was used to being the voice of justice, the one who took control when things went wrong. But this time, it was about Miguel, her nephew, and the pain she felt was deep. Deeper than any injustice she had witnessed before. There were no words in that moment that could console him, and that frustrated her. Anger welled up in her chest with every kilometer the taxi drove. Jessica's face, the flight attendant, kept flashing in her mind, the coldness in her eyes when she decided to label Miguel as disruptive. The injustice was so clear, so obvious, yet at that moment on the plane, she had felt powerless, as if her experience as a civil rights lawyer meant nothing in the face of that reality. Miguel, on the other hand, didn't know how to express what he was feeling. Confusion and shame overwhelmed him. He felt small, vulnerable, as if he had been reduced to nothing in front of all those strangers who watched as he was removed from the plane. He remembered how some passengers had looked at him with disapproval, as if they had agreed with Jessica. That was what hurt the most. Planes were supposed to be places of equality. Everyone flew to the same destination, everyone shared the same space in the sky. But on that flight, it became clear that for some, his skin color, his clothes, even his mere presence, was a problem. When they finally arrived at Sophia's small apartment, they both sat in the living room in silence. The light from the sunset streamed through the curtains, but it brought no comfort. Miguel, with his hands clasped together, couldn't stop thinking about what he had done wrong. He had been polite, he had been kind. So why had he been treated like that? Every time he tried to find an explanation, he ran into a wall. There was no logical reason that could justify what had happened. And that was what tormented him the most. Sophia, watching Miguel from across the room, could see in his eyes that internal struggle, that pain of not understanding why. She had seen that look before in many of her clients who had been victims of discrimination, but seeing it in Miguel was unbearable. She knew it was her duty to protect him, but she also knew that sometimes the only way to help was to let the person process the pain on their own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophia broke the silence. Her voice was soft but firm, as it always was when she was about to speak about something serious. She told Miguel that what had happened wasn't his fault. Miguel, this wasn't because of something you did wrong. This happened because they chose to see you as a threat over something as superficial as the color of your skin and the way you dressed. It's not fair. And most importantly, it wasn't your fault. Miguel looked at her, and for the first time since they had gotten off the plane, tears filled his eyes. He didn't want to cry, didn't want to show weakness, but the truth was that everything he had been holding back was beginning to surface. Sophia's words struck deep. He knew, deep down, that she was right, but it was hard to shake off the feeling that somehow he had been at fault. He wanted to scream, he wanted to understand, but most of all, he wished this had never happened. Sophia stood up slowly and walked over to him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're going to do something about this," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We're not going to let this go. I know you feel powerless right now, but trust me, this isn't the end." The determination in his aunt's voice was enough to spark something inside Miguel. Though he was still processing what had happened, something within him started to shift. He knew his aunt wasn't one to give up easily. If she said they would fight, they would. But how? How could they take on such a big airline? How could two ordinary people change something as Sophia was already thinking about that? She knew that fighting in court was an option, but she also knew that the world was changing. Nowadays, justice didn't always come from the courts. Social media had the power to amplify a small voice into a roar that no one could ignore. And she intended to use that power. That very night, after Miguel went to bed, Sophia sat in front of her laptop. She knew she had to act quickly. The more time that passed, the easier it would be for the airline to try to cover up the incident or, worse, deny it entirely. She opened her social media accounts and began drafting a detailed post about what had happened. But it wasn't just a narrative. Sophia was a lawyer, and she knew how to structure an argument that could draw people's attention. She described every detail with precision, from the passengers' glances to Jessica's cold words and the humiliation they felt when they were removed without any valid reason. Rooted as racism. When she finished writing, she added a photo of Miguel, one that clearly showed his expression of confusion and pain after the incident. And then, most importantly, she ended the post with an open question to her followers: how many more times will situations like this happen before things change? As she hit send, Sophia felt a new battle had begun, but this time they weren't alone. Social media had the power to make the invisible visible, to apply pressure where there had been none before. And with any luck, they could hold the airline accountable for what they had done. As Sophia shut down her laptop, she felt a bit lighter. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight. She was doing this for Miguel, but also for all those who had ever been silenced by racism. The sun was already high when Miguel woke up, but the weight of what had happened the day before still sat heavily on his shoulders. Everything still seemed confusing and unjust. He walked slowly toward the kitchen, where he saw his Aunt Sophia sitting at the table, focused on her laptop. She was typing with an expression Miguel knew well, a mix of focus and determination. He knew something was being prepared. For him, what had happened on the plane was still a knot in his throat, something he couldn't swallow, but also couldn't figure out how to unravel. Sophia, for her part, knew exactly what to do. She had spent the night formulating a plan. As a civil rights lawyer, she was in the habit of turning outrage into action, and this time would be no different. What had happened to Miguel on the plane wasn't just a misunderstanding or an isolated incident, it was a blatant violation of his rights as a person. The discrimination they had faced had to be exposed, and Sophia was ready to take action. After a quiet breakfast, Sophia decided it was time to talk to Miguel. She called him into the living room, and as he sat on the couch, she explained her plan. The first part of the strategy wouldn't just be taking the case to court, but using social media to share their story. Sophia understood that in today's world, public opinion held immense power. A story like Miguel's, shared the right way, could reach thousands, maybe even millions of people. It could generate a wave of support that would force the airline to be held accountable. Miguel listened carefully, but he was still processing everything his aunt was proposing. It wasn't just about bringing their case to justice, it was about exposing it to the world. He felt nervous, but there was something else too. He knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to do something, and although the idea of his story going public made him feel vulnerable, he also understood that this was an opportunity to make a difference. Sophia began by drafting a post on her social media. With the precision that only a lawyer could have, she recounted everything that had happened on the plane, from the moment they boarded, to the passengers' glances, to Jessica's cold and unfair treatment. She described how Miguel had been unfairly singled out, how they had both been humiliated when they were kicked off the flight without a valid reason. Her account was clear, compelling, and it highlighted the discrimination they, like so many other black people, faced daily. Miguel watched as his aunt typed. He knew Sophia was speaking for him, but he also realized that his own voice was important. So, when Sophia finished writing the post, Miguel asked if he could make a video. He wanted to tell the story from his perspective, in his own words. He wanted people to see his face, to understand how he felt being treated like that. Miguel sat in front of his phone's camera. He took a deep breath and began to speak. At first, his voice was low, almost shy, but as he recounted the details of what he had experienced, his tone became firmer. He spoke about how he had been treated as though he were a threat, simply for asking questions. He described Jessica's cold look, the indifference of the other passengers, and how they had made him feel like he didn't belong there. As he spoke, the emotions he had tried to suppress began to surface. His sadness turned into determination, into a need for justice. When the video was finished, Sophia watched it carefully. It was clear that it was a powerful testimony. It showed Miguel as he truly was, an innocent young man who had only wanted to enjoy his first flight but had been singled out and humiliated because of the color of his skin. Without wasting time, Sophia uploaded the video along with her detailed post. The impact was immediate. Within hours, the story began to circulate. People from all over the country, and even abroad, started sharing it, expressing their outrage and support. Social media comments flooded in. Some users shared similar experiences of discrimination they had faced. Others offered their support and demanded justice. Miguel's story was starting to resonate far beyond his close circle, reaching people he had never met but who perfectly understood the pain. As Miguel's video went viral, the media started to take notice. Local news programs began requesting interviews, eager to learn more about the case and hear from Miguel. Soon, the media attention grew, and what had begun as an incident on a flight turned into a broader symbol of the fight against everyday racism. Civil rights organizations also reached out to Sophia. They offered their support, both legal and strategic. They wanted to help take the case to court, but they also understood that the real battle wouldn't just be fought in the courtroom, it would take place in the court of public opinion. Miguel, who at first had felt small and defeated, began to realize the power of his voice. Seeing how his story was inspiring others gave him a new perspective. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all the people who, like him, had been victims of racial discrimination and had never had the opportunity to speak up. But as public support grew, Sophia knew that the real battle was yet to come. The airline that had kicked them off the flight issued a weak statement, saying they would investigate the incident, but their words rang hollow. To Sophia, that wasn't enough. She didn't just want an apology. She wanted real reform. She wanted the airline to change its policies, and she wanted the people responsible for the humiliation they had suffered to face tangible consequences. Miguel's story continued to grow, and with each passing day, the pressure on the airline increased. The fight for justice wasn't over, but with the power of social media, Miguel and Sophia had taken the first step toward real change. Although the road ahead would be long, they now knew they weren't alone in this fight. The days following Miguel's viral video were a whirlwind of emotions. Support on social media kept growing in an astonishing way. People from different parts of the country sent messages of solidarity, shared their own experiences of discrimination, and often voiced their frustration with the everyday racism they faced. For Miguel, it was a revelation. At first, he had been afraid of exposing his story, but now, seeing the impact it had, he felt a greater responsibility. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for many people who, like him, had been silenced for far too long. Sophia, however, knew that the battle was just beginning. Although public support was crucial, real justice could only be achieved in the courts. The video had pressured the airline to issue a vague public statement, promising to investigate the case, but Sophia knew that was insufficient. Empty promises wouldn't bring change. They needed concrete action, a legal response that would force the company to acknowledge its mistake and, more importantly, do something to prevent cases like Miguel's from happening again. With her vast experience as a civil rights attorney, Sophia had already begun building the case. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Large corporations, like the airline, had powerful legal teams and resources. But that didn't intimidate her. For years, she had faced similar challenges and had learned that when justice is on your side, the truth is a powerful tool. Miguel's story was becoming a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for many others who had endured similar injustices. And Sophia, with her determination and legal expertise, was ready to lead the charge forward. The first step was to contact the witnesses. Sophia knew there were people on the plane who had seen everything, and some of them had already expressed their support on social media. Sophia spent days tracking down those who were willing to testify. There were some who preferred to stay out of it, afraid of getting involved in a lawsuit against a big corporation, but there were also those who felt morally obligated to do the right thing. One of those witnesses was a man who had recorded the incident on his cell phone. His recording clearly showed how Miguel was only asking innocent questions and how the flight attendant Jessica, without any reason, accused him of being a disturbance. The video also captured the moment when Miguel and Sophia were escorted off the plane, while some passengers looked on indifferently. That recording would be a key piece of evidence in their case. Sophia gathered all the evidence: the recording, witness statements, information about the airline's policies, and, of course, Miguel's testimony. She knew the legal strategy had to be precise and compelling. Not only would she sue the airline for racial discrimination, but she would also argue that her nephew had suffered emotional and psychological harm due to the unjust treatment he had received. Meanwhile, Miguel was dealing with his own emotions. While the support he received on social media motivated him, the reality of having to relive the incident in a courtroom made him nervous. It wasn't easy for him to revisit every detail of what had happened: the humiliation, the fear, the injustice. But Sophia stood by his side, supporting him every step of the way, reminding him that their fight was not just for him, but for all the people who had been victims of a system that allowed racism to be hidden in small, everyday actions. The day of the first hearing arrived. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. On one side, the airline's legal team, dressed in expensive suits and with a confident demeanor. On the other side, Sophia, Miguel, and their small team of lawyers and activists who had decided to join the cause. For Miguel, being in that room was terrifying. He felt like all eyes were on him, as if he was under the microscope again, just like he had been on the plane. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sophia was the first to speak, presenting the case clearly and precisely. She laid out how Miguel had been treated unfairly, how the airline had failed to protect his basic rights as both a passenger and a human being. She explained how this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a larger problem of systemic racism that affected many people of color. She used every piece of evidence she had gathered: the video from the witness, the passenger statements, and most importantly, Miguel's testimony. When it was Miguel's turn to speak, his voice trembled at first, but as he recounted what he had experienced, his tone grew stronger. He described how he had boarded the plane full of excitement, only for that excitement to turn into fear and humiliation. He described the coldness in Jessica's gaze, how he felt powerless when he was escorted off the plane, as if his very presence there had been a mistake from the beginning. His words were raw but honest, and as he spoke, the courtroom was completely silent. The airline's legal team tried to downplay the incident, arguing that it had been a misunderstanding, that Jessica was simply following safety protocols. They attempted to portray Miguel as a restless young man who had caused a disturbance for other passengers. But the evidence was there, the images and testimonies told a different story. What was really at stake wasn't just an incident on a flight, it was Miguel's right, and the right of so many others, to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance. With the first hearing over, Sofia and Miguel stepped out of the courtroom. The fresh air outside gave them a brief moment of relief, but they knew the fight wasn't over yet. The case would continue, and although they had taken an important step, the road to justice would be long. Sofia remained focused, knowing the next steps were crucial. She planned to keep building the case, using not only the legal system but also the growing public support that had come from the viral video. The story had already gained significant attention, and people were watching closely. For Miguel, the courtroom experience had been tough, but he was no longer the same person who had boarded the plane that day. He now understood that his voice had power, and with Sofia by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They knew that, no matter how strong the airline's legal team might be, they had truth and justice on their side, and that gave them the strength to keep fighting. Miguel, who had entered the courtroom nervous and scared, walked out with a different feeling. He had faced his fear, told his truth, and though the trial wasn't over, he knew he had done the right thing. As they walked back to the car, Sofia looked at her nephew with pride. Their fight for justice was not only bearing fruit, but it was also transforming Miguel into someone stronger, more aware of his own power. Support continued to pour in from all corners of the country. Everyday people, activists, and even public figures were starting to show their support for Miguel and Sofia. The story was no longer just theirs, it had become a symbol of resistance against racism, a struggle that many had faced, but that now, thanks to Miguel's bravery, was at the center of national conversation. But the battle wasn't over. There were more hearings to come, more difficult moments to face. However, both Sofia and Miguel knew they were on the right path. What had started as a flight from hell, a painful and humiliating experience, had now turned into a fight for justice that could change more lives than they ever imagined. The days following the first hearing were a whirlwind for Miguel and Sofia. While they knew the fight would be long, they hadn't been prepared for the avalanche of attention that followed. The story was no longer just theirs. It had transcended the walls of the courtroom and become a national and, in many cases, international topic. On social media, in news reports, and in everyday conversations, people were talking about Miguel's case. It was as if, overnight, his experience had transformed into an emblem of the fight against racism and discrimination that thousands of people of color faced daily. But as the public support and attention continued to grow, Miguel felt the pressure building on him. Since the incident on the plane, his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. Before, he had been just a curious young man, passionate about planes and travel. Now, he was a symbol, and that transformation was not easy to carry. Though his Aunt Sofia supported him unconditionally and constantly reminded him how important his fight was, Miguel couldn't help but feel the weight of expectations. He wondered if he was truly up to everything people expected of him. Miguel's mornings were no longer what they used to be. Waking up and checking his phone had become an unavoidable habit. Each day, his inbox was filled with messages of support from people all over the world, young people sharing their own experiences of discrimination, parents praising his bravery, and activists encouraging him to keep going. But there were also critics. There were always those who, hidden behind the anonymity of the internet, accused him of exaggerating or seeking fame. Those comments were the hardest to ignore. While he tried to focus on the positive, the attacks affected him more than he was willing to admit. Sophia, meanwhile, was handling the case from a more strategic perspective. She knew the airline would try anything to discredit their claim. After the first hearing, the airline's legal team began leaking information to the press, suggesting that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding. They were trying to soften the facts, to downplay the incident. But Sophia wasn't going to be intimidated. She was determined to show that what had happened wasn't a simple misunderstanding, but a clear act of racial discrimination. One day, while Sophia was going over witness statements again and preparing the next steps in the trial, she received an unexpected call. It was from one of the country's most influential civil rights organizations. They had been following Miguel's case and wanted to join the fight. They offered not only legal support but also strategic advice and the possibility of mobilizing other similar organizations. For Sophia, this was an invaluable opportunity. She knew that although her team was strong, having the backing of such a large organization could make all the difference. This new partnership gave Sophia and Miguel an extra boost. It wasn't just about legal strength but also about organizing a broader movement around their case. This case was no longer just about one flight or one airline, it was about challenging the systemic racism embedded in society. With this new support, Sophia began planning the next steps in the trial and beyond, thinking of ways to ensure that the fight for justice would resonate far beyond the courtroom. For Miguel, the involvement of a major civil rights organization was both empowering and overwhelming. He understood now more than ever that his fight was much bigger than himself. And while that realization came with pressure, it also brought purpose. He wasn't just seeking justice for what happened to him, he was part of a much larger movement for change, and that gave him the strength to keep going, despite the difficulties and the pressure. Sophia, too, felt the momentum growing. She was prepared to face whatever the airline's legal team would throw at them. With the additional support of the civil rights organization, she knew their case was stronger than ever. And while the road ahead would be long, they were ready to continue the fight, not just for Miguel, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by discrimination. As the trial moved forward, Sophia and Miguel knew that they were not alone. The story that had begun with a single flight had turned into a beacon of hope for many. And though the outcome was still uncertain, their determination was unwavering. They would see this through to the end, knowing that their fight was about more than just justice for Miguel, it was about justice for all. The next day, Sophia organized a meeting with the representatives of the civil rights organization. They gathered in a small conference room in a building downtown. Miguel was invited to the meeting, but he was visibly nervous. He still hadn't gotten used to being the center of attention in such formal settings. As he entered the room, he felt intimidated by the gazes of the lawyers and activists already waiting for him. It seemed like everyone was there for him, which only intensified the pressure he had been carrying since the beginning of it all. The meeting began with a summary of the case, and while the lawyers discussed legal strategies, Miguel could hardly concentrate. His mind drifted back to the day of the incident on the plane. He recalled the stares, Jessica the flight attendant's harsh voice, and how it had felt like the entire world turned against him without him understanding why. But he also remembered the support he had received afterward, the power of social media, and how his story had inspired so many people. Despite the fear and pressure, something inside him told him that pushing forward was the right thing to do. After hours of discussion, Sophia and the organization's team decided that, in addition to continuing with the lawsuit, it was time to take the fight to another level. They wanted to leverage the attention Miguel's story had gained on social media and in the press to launch a broader campaign against racism in air travel. They knew that Miguel's experience wasn't an isolated case. They had received messages from many other people of color who shared similar stories, being treated with suspicion, ignored, or even removed from flights for no apparent reason. What had happened to Miguel was just one more manifestation of a larger problem. The campaign launched shortly after, and the impact was immediate. Videos of testimonies from people who had experienced similar situations began circulating on social media, accompanied by calls for airlines to revise their policies and provide better training for their employees on diversity and inclusion. The pressure on the airline involved in Miguel's case grew by the day. The media covered the campaign extensively, and company executives were starting to feel the weight of public opinion. However, the airline wasn't ready to back down easily. Instead of acknowledging their mistake, they began investing more in their legal team, trying to delay the trial and searching for arguments to minimize their responsibility. For Sophia, this came as no surprise. She knew that large corporations rarely admitted fault without a fight. But while the company fought in court, the movement outside was only growing. What had started as a discrimination lawsuit had turned into a national conversation about the rights of black people in public spaces, particularly in travel. Miguel, although still grappling with the fear and anxiety of being the face of such a significant fight, was beginning to feel stronger. Every message of support, every story he received from people who had gone through the same thing, reminded him why he had decided to move forward. He knew that, although the trial wasn't over, they were already making a difference. He saw it in the discussions on the news, in the questions people were beginning to ask about how people of color were treated in places where they should feel safe and welcome. Sophia, always focused and strategic, constantly reminded him that this fight wasn't just about them. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, who had been treated as less simply because of how they looked. Every day, as they prepared for the next phase of the trial, she would tell Miguel that, no matter the final outcome, they had already won something. They had started a conversation that could no longer be ignored. But even though Miguel was starting to feel stronger, he knew that true justice had yet to be achieved. The hearings continued, witnesses were called to testify, and the airline's lawyers did everything they could to discredit his story. However, with each obstacle they faced, Miguel and Sophia stood firm. They knew that the path to justice was rarely easy, but they were determined to walk it to the end. With the campaign in full swing and the trial moving forward, it became clear that this fight wouldn't be limited to a court verdict. Miguel's story had already inspired many, but both he and Sophia knew that the battle for equality and respect in travel, and in daily life, was just beginning. The day of the second hearing had arrived. The air was thick with tension, both inside and outside the courthouse. The anticipation was palpable, and this was no longer just about Miguel's case. His story had transcended personal boundaries and had become a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination. Television cameras and journalists waited outside the building, ready to capture every detail. Civil rights activists, organizations, and people who supported Miguel had gathered in solidarity. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the moment. Inside the courtroom, Sophia was calm, yet determined. She had spent the last few weeks preparing for this day, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. Miguel, sitting beside her, still felt the nervous flutter in his stomach, but he also knew he wasn't alone in this. As they faced the legal team of the airline, who had once again tried to portray the incident as a mere misunderstanding, Miguel's resolve solidified. He was ready to tell his story again and fight for the justice he can. The courtroom fell silent as the proceedings began, but the fight outside those walls was just as important. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about changing the way people of color were treated in spaces where everyone should feel equal. Miguel, dressed in a simple yet elegant dark suit, sat next to his Aunt Sophia in the courtroom. He felt like all eyes were on him, and though he was nervous, there was something inside him that pushed him forward. The journey to this moment had been long and painful, but he knew that his fight was not just for him. He had received thousands of messages of support from people who, like him, had suffered acts of discrimination in silence, without the opportunity to be heard. Now, he was the voice for all those people. Sophia, with her usual composure, reviewed the documents in front of her one last time. She knew this hearing would be decisive. As an experienced lawyer, she understood that the airline would not back down easily. Throughout her career, she had faced powerful corporations and oppressive systems, but this case carried a different emotional weight. She was defending her nephew, someone she had watched grow up, and whose pain she knew intimately. Though Sophia had learned to keep her emotions in check in the courtroom, she felt the personal burden of this case. Every word she spoke had to be precise and sharp. She wasn't just seeking legal justice, she was fighting to restore Miguel's dignity. They deserved. When the judge entered the room, silence fell over the courtroom. Everyone stood, and Miguel felt a knot form in his stomach. The hearing began with the airline's lawyers presenting their defense. The company's strategy was clear: they wanted to downplay the incident, presenting it as a misunderstanding related to flight safety. They tried to paint Miguel as a young man who had caused a disturbance during the flight, suggesting that Jessica, the flight attendant's actions, had been necessary to ensure the safety of the passengers. This approach didn't surprise Sophia, but it filled her with indignation. She knew the airline was trying to divert attention away from the racial discrimination, framing the case as a matter of protocol. Throughout the hearing, the company's lawyers did everything they could to discredit Miguel. They presented documents on the airline's policies and testimony from employees who supported the decision to remove him from the flight. They attempted to create an image of a disruptive passenger, someone who had caused trouble. For Miguel, hearing these words felt like invisible blows. Even though he knew these lies were part of the strategy, he couldn't help but feel like they were attacking him on the deepest level. It was as if, once again, they were questioning his right to be there, as if his very presence had been a threat from the start. Sophia, watching the airline's lawyers build their false narrative, remained steadfast. She knew the true power lay in the evidence and the testimonies she had gathered. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with a firm and confident posture. Her voice echoed through the room, clear and determined. She began by reminding the court that this wasn't a simple case of a misunderstanding. She explained that what had happened to Miguel wasn't an exception, but a manifestation of a larger problem: racial discrimination in air travel. Sophia presented the video recorded by one of the passengers, which clearly showed how Miguel had been unfairly treated. In the footage, it was evident how the young man, simply asking questions out of curiosity, had been met with disdain by Jessica, the flight attendant. The video captured the exact moment when Jessica, without any real provocation, decided that Miguel was a problem. The recording showed other passengers watching, some with indifference, others with discomfort, but no one intervened when Miguel and Sophia were escorted off the plane. The visual testimony was undeniable. There was no way to justify what was seen in the footage. As the video played in the courtroom, the silence was profound. Every second of the recording made it increasingly clear what had truly happened: an act of discrimination that had started with a simple question and ended in public humiliation. Miguel, seated at his table, watched the video with a mix of emotions. It was difficult to relive that moment, but at the same time, seeing it from the distance time had made him realize the blatant injustice he had suffered. After the video, Sophia called several witnesses. Among them was the passenger who had recorded the footage, and others who, although they hadn't intervened at the time, felt uncomfortable with what they had seen. Their testimonies were clear: Miguel had not been disruptive, he hadn't caused problems. The only thing he had done was be a curious young man, interested in learning about the flight, something completely normal for someone experiencing their first plane trip. The most important testimony was Miguel's. When he stood up to speak, he felt all the eyes in the room on him. He knew this was his moment, the moment to tell his truth. His voice trembled at first, but as he began to recount what he had lived through that day, his tone grew stronger. He described his initial excitement when boarding the plane, the thrill he felt at the prospect of flying for the first time. Then, he explained how that excitement turned to confusion when Jessica accused him of being a problem. Miguel spoke about the humiliation he felt when he was escorted off the plane, in front of all the passengers, as if he had done something wrong. His testimony was powerful, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Miguel didn't try to exaggerate or dramatize the facts. His account was sincere and honest, and that was what impacted everyone in the room. As he spoke, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated incident. His experience represented something much deeper, the pain of being judged and discriminated against simply because of his appearance, because of something completely beyond his control. As he finished his statement, Miguel felt a great weight lift from his chest. He had told his truth, and now everything depended on the court. The hearing ended with a sense of anticipation in the air. The airline had tried to discredit him, but the evidence and testimonies were clear. Miguel had been the victim of an injustice, and now the court had to decide if the company were outside the courtroom. Journalists gathered, eager to get statements. Miguel, accompanied by Sofia, decided not to speak to the press at that moment. He knew the important words had been said inside the courtroom, not outside. However, as they walked to the car, Miguel couldn't help but feel relieved. He had faced one of his greatest fears, reliving the pain in public. And he had done it with dignity. Sofia, beside him, looked at him with pride. She knew there was still a long road ahead before a verdict would be reached, but regardless of the outcome, she was sure that Miguel had already won a battle. He had reclaimed his voice, and with it, had inspired many others. The days following the second hearing felt endless. Despite the strength of the case and the compelling evidence Sofia had presented, the court had not yet issued a verdict. For Miguel, every passing minute was a test of patience and emotional endurance. He had told his truth in public, relived the pain of that humiliation, and faced the airline in court. But now, the weight of the waiting was suffocating him. He couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he tried to distract himself, his mind drifted back to the trial. Had his testimony been enough? Had the evidence been clear enough to show that what he had suffered wasn't a simple misunderstanding, but a blatant act of discrimination? Sofia, on the other hand, was calmer, though no less vigilant. She knew the courts could be unpredictable, and although Miguel's case was strong, the airline had deep resources. In her experience as a civil rights lawyer, she had learned not to take anything for granted. She spent her nights reviewing notes, anticipating possible moves from the airline. Her primary concern was that the company's lawyers would try to delay the verdict or even seek a settlement to avoid an unfavorable decision. She knew that, often, large corporations preferred to pay to make cases disappear, but Sofia wasn't willing to accept a simple settlement. For her, what was at stake was much more than money. It was a matter of justice. Miguel, meanwhile, remained in a constant state of unrest. Despite knowing his aunt had the situation under control, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was in a state of limbo. He had become a public figure, a symbol of resistance, but in his heart, he was still just a young man who longed to return to some sense of normalcy. He painfully recalled the moments before the flight, the excitement he had felt, the anticipation of traveling for the first time. All of that had been ripped away in a single blow, and now, despite the support he received from thousands of people, what he wanted most was for justice to be served. Social media continued to buzz with support and discussions surrounding his case. The campaign that Sophia had initiated, along with civil rights organizations, continued to gain momentum. More testimonies from Black individuals who had experienced similar situations on flights were being shared, suspicious glances, unjustified questioning, and, in some cases, arbitrary expulsions, just like what had happened to Miguel. Each story added more weight to Miguel's case, showing that his experience wasn't an isolated incident but part of a systemic problem of racism within the airline industry. One afternoon, as Miguel was scrolling through his phone, he received an unexpected message. It was from a man named Andres, a former employee of the airline that had removed him from the flight. Andres told him that he had been following the case and, although he no longer worked for the company, he had information that could be useful in the trial. At first, Miguel wasn't sure if he should trust him. After all, the airline had been trying to discredit his story from the very beginning, and he feared that this could be some kind of trap. After discussing it with Sophia, they decided to meet with Andres. The meeting was set in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Miguel was nervous. There was something strange about the situation, and he couldn't help but wonder why a former employee of the airline would want to help them. However, when Andres arrived, his demeanor appeared sincere. He was a man in his 40s, with a tired face and a serious expression. Andres began by explaining that he had worked for the airline for several years, and although he had left his position a few months earlier, he had witnessed many incidents similar to what had happened to Miguel. What had struck him the most, he said, was how the company often covered up these cases, ensuring they didn't reach the courts or, when they did, making sure the passengers were discredited to avoid a media crisis. But the most shocking revelation Andres made was that the airline had held internal meetings after Miguel's incident. In those meetings, according to him, the executives discussed how to handle the case, knowing that Jessica, the flight attendant, had acted completely inappropriately. Andres explained that the airline not only tried to protect Jessica but also devised a strategy to spread the narrative that Miguel had been the cause of the disturbance on the flight. Sophia listened carefully as Andres spoke. She knew this information could be crucial, but she needed evidence. She asked Andres if there was any way to obtain documents or emails that would support his claims. Andres, clearly nervous, admitted that he didn't have direct access to those documents, but he knew of the existence of internal memos that detailed instructions to employees on how to handle discrimination cases. Those memos, if they could gain access to them, could be the key to proving that the airline had not only committed an act of discrimination but had deliberately tried to cover it up. After the meeting, Miguel and Sophia returned home with a renewed sense of hope. If they could obtain those documents, the case could take an unexpected and decisive turn. But they also knew this wouldn't be easy. The airline would do everything possible to protect that information. Sophia wasted no time. She immediately filed a request with the court for the airline to hand over the internal memos related to Miguel's removal from the flight. She knew there would be resistance, but she was confident that if the judge accepted the request, they would have a real chance to win the case definitively. The following days were tense. As expected, the airline rejected the initial request, arguing that the documents were confidential and not directly related to the case. But Sophia, with her experience, persisted. She knew the airline was hiding something. Sophia continued to fight, pushing for the court to review the documents under the argument that they were vital to exposing a pattern of discrimination within the company. She emphasized that this wasn't just about Miguel's experience, but about the broader systemic issues the airline had been complicit in covering up. The pressure continued to build, both in the courtroom and in the public eye. The momentum behind the case had grown, with civil rights groups and public figures rallying around Miguel's cause. The airline, under increasing scrutiny, faced the challenge of maintaining their stance as evidence mounted against them. For Miguel, this process, though stressful, had become a journey toward reclaiming his dignity, knowing that the fight for justice was no longer just his, but one shared by countless others. The court would eventually have to make a decision regarding the release of the internal documents. As the waiting continued, Miguel realized that while he longed for normalcy, this fight had become bigger than him. His courage, alongside Sofia's unyielding persistence, was forging a path for others who had been silenced by similar acts of injustice. The fight for those documents, and for justice, wasn't over, but Miguel and Sofia were more determined than ever to see it through. Finally, after several days of negotiations, the judge ordered the airline to hand over part of the requested documents. Miguel couldn't believe it when he received the news. He knew that this decision was a victory in itself. Although they didn't yet have the documents in hand, the fact that the airline was being forced to provide them meant they were one step closer to uncovering the truth. When the documents finally arrived, Sofia and her team meticulously reviewed them. Among the paperwork, they found exactly what they had been looking for: internal memos detailing how the company should handle cases of passengers removed for security reasons. In one memo, dated just a few days after Miguel's incident, it clearly stated that the airline was aware that the flight attendant, Jessica, had acted inappropriately, but it had been decided internally not to admit the mistake publicly to avoid reputational damage. The document also mentioned that the company had devised a strategy to minimize the impact of the case in the media. This was the evidence Sofia had been waiting for. With these documents in hand, the truth was finally out. The airline had not only discriminated against Miguel but had also tried to cover it up. Holding the documents, Sofia felt a weight lift off her shoulders. After so many weeks of tension and struggle, she finally had clear proof that the airline had acted deliberately and unjustly. Not only had they committed an act of discrimination by removing Miguel from the plane, but they had also tried to conceal it, protecting their staff and designing a strategy to minimize the consequences. These internal memos were undeniable evidence that Miguel had been treated unacceptably, and that, despite knowing this, the company had chosen to cover up the incident instead of correcting the error. Sitting at the dining table, Sofia carefully examined every line. The documents, which had arrived after days of legal pressure, detailed how the airline had organized internal meetings to assess the media impact of Miguel's case. Jessica's name appeared several times in the memos. What was most shocking was that, instead of taking responsibility for their employees' misconduct, the company had decided to back her version of events and divert public attention by arguing that Miguel had been disruptive. They had manipulated the facts to make it seem like the entire situation was a misunderstanding. In the context of flight, Miguel, sitting on the other side of the table, watched his aunt as she read. He knew these papers were crucial, but he also understood there was still a long road ahead. Even though discovering these documents was a devastating blow to the airline's defense, he knew that the company's legal team would fight with everything they had to discredit them. Miguel couldn't help but feel nervous. Despite all the support he had received over the past months, the trauma of being unfairly removed from the plane still lingered. Every time he thought about the incident, the humiliation and fear of that day returned. Sofia glanced at her nephew for a moment. She could see the tension in his face, but she also noticed the strength that had grown in him since all this began. Miguel had changed. What started as a painful experience, a racist act that had left him confused and hurt, had transformed him into someone more aware of his power, more determined to fight for what was right. However, Sophia also knew that Miguel was still processing everything he had lived through, and the constant public exposure was taking an emotional toll. She decided that, after this trial, they would need to find space for him to heal. "These documents are pure gold," Sophia said with a smile, pulling Miguel out of his thoughts. "They clearly show that the airline knew they made a mistake and, instead of correcting it, they decided to protect Jessica and blame you." Miguel nodded, feeling a mix of relief and concern. He knew they had an advantage now, but the fear of what was to come remained. With the documents in hand, Sophia reached out to her legal team. She knew they couldn't waste any time. These internal memos needed to be presented in court as soon as possible. She organized a meeting with the other lawyers and activists who had been supporting the case from the beginning. At that meeting, they discussed the next steps, presenting the documents as key evidence in the trial and preparing a strategy to anticipate the airline's legal counterattacks. The day of the third hearing arrived quickly. The courtroom was packed once again. Miguel's case had captured national attention, and television cameras were stationed outside the building, ready to report on any developments. Activists and civil rights organizations had also gathered in support of Miguel, holding signs and chanting slogans for racial justice. Although Miguel was nervous, he could feel the support from all the people surrounding him. As he entered the courtroom, with his aunt by his side, he took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, with both sides knowing that the internal memos Sophia had obtained could shift the entire case. The airline's lawyers would do everything they could to discredit the documents, but the truth was finally out in the open. Miguel knew that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for all the people who had suffered in silence, waiting for someone to expose the truth. As Sophia presented the internal memos to the court, detailing how the airline had deliberately covered up their wrongdoing, the tension in the room was palpable. The evidence was irrefutable, and the airline's defense, which had relied on framing Miguel as a disruptive passenger, began to crumble. The judge carefully examined the documents, and the courtroom waited in anticipation. As the hearing progressed, Miguel felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. He knew they were closer than ever to achieving justice, but the scars of the past still weighed heavily on him. This fight, which had started as a deeply personal battle, had grown into something far larger. It wasn't just about his own experience anymore, it was about challenging a system that had allowed this kind of discrimination to continue unchecked. With the support of Sophia, the legal team, and the countless individuals who stood behind him, Miguel was ready to face whatever came next. Whether the battle ended with this hearing or dragged on further, he knew that they had made significant strides, not just in seeking justice for what had happened to him, but in standing up for others who had been wronged. The truth had been exposed, and now, the world was watching. Sophia, always confident in the courtroom, was the one to present the new documents. With her steady and calm voice, she laid out how the airline had planned to cover up the incident, prioritizing their reputation over the truth. The memos, projected on a screen for the judge and jury to see clearly, left no room for doubt. The company had deliberately lied. The eyes of the airline's lawyers hardened as they realized the devastating blow this evidence dealt to their defense. The judge quietly reviewed the documents, his face impassive. Meanwhile, the airline's lawyers scrambled to craft a response, but it was clear they hadn't anticipated this revelation. After Sophia finished her presentation, the airline's legal team tried to argue that the memos weren't relevant to the case and didn't directly demonstrate racial discrimination against Miguel. They claimed that the meetings discussed in the documents were standard procedures to protect passenger safety, and that the decision to support Jessica, the flight attendant, was based on her experience as a company employee. However, their defense rang hollow. The evidence was too overwhelming. Sophia's team had proven that the incident wasn't just a single act of discrimination, but that it had been followed by a deliberate cover-up operation to protect the airline's reputation at the expense of Miguel's dignity and rights. When it was Miguel's turn to speak again, his voice was steadier than ever. He was no longer the young man filled with fear and confusion from that day on the plane months ago. Now, he fully understood what had happened and was ready to fight to the end. He recounted how he had felt that day, but this time he did so with a determination that inspired everyone in the courtroom. "I wasn't just humiliated that day," he said clearly, "I was treated as if I didn't belong, as if my life didn't have the same value as the other passengers. And what hurts the most is that instead of correcting that mistake, they chose to lie to cover it up." The silence in the room was deafening when Miguel finished speaking. His words hung in the air, and everyone knew that this moment was pivotal. As the judge withdrew to deliberate, the atmosphere was one of anticipation. They knew the evidence was on their side, but until the verdict was delivered, nothing was certain. When the judge returned, Miguel's heart pounded in his chest. In a matter of minutes, his future, and the truth, would be decided. The silence in the courtroom was overwhelming. Miguel could feel his heart beating loudly as he waited for the judge to return. Every second felt like an eternity. Sitting beside his Aunt Sophia, he knew this moment was the culmination of a long and arduous journey, one that had begun with an act of injustice and humiliation months ago, but now, finally, was nearing its resolution. The air in the room was thick with expectation, and Miguel felt the tension take hold of him, a mix of hope and fear enveloping him completely. Sophia, sitting next to him, maintained her serene composure, though she too could feel the tension in the air. Her experience in the courtroom had taught her not to anticipate too much, but in her heart, she knew they had a solid case. The airline's internal documents, the proof of the cover-up, and, most importantly, Miguel's honest and powerful testimony had tipped the scales in their favor. Still, she knew the judicial system could be unpredictable. But today represented not just a legal battle but the possibility of real change for many people who, like Miguel, had been silenced and humiliated without reason. When the judge returned to the room, the murmurs immediately died down. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. The judge took his seat, calmly reviewing the papers in front of him with deliberate poise. Miguel felt time slow down, as if everything he had experienced was about to be decided in a matter of seconds. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room, journalists, activists, lawyers, all focused on him and what was about to happen. The judge began his statement in a calm, formal manner. He explained how he had carefully reviewed all the evidence presented, from the video showing the unjust treatment Miguel had received to the documents that revealed the airline's cover-up strategy to protect their public image instead of admitting their mistake. He also acknowledged the testimonies, both from Miguel and witnesses, confirming that at no point had Miguel been disruptive or posed any threat to flight safety. As the judge continued, Sophia kept her eyes fixed on him, not missing a single word. She knew the verdict was about to be revealed, and that this moment could change everything. Miguel, beside her, could hardly breathe. His mind kept returning to the day of the flight when he had been removed for no reason, feeling the weight of the other passengers' suspicious and disdainful stares. He had relived that day so many times since then, but now, he was close to getting the closure he so desperately needed. Finally, the judge looked up and announced his verdict. In his words, he recognized that Miguel had been the victim of an act of racial discrimination. He explained that, based on the evidence and testimonies, the airline had failed in its duty to treat Miguel with respect and dignity and had violated his rights by unjustly removing him from the flight. He also highlighted the seriousness of the subsequent cover-up, noting that the decision to protect the airline instead of doing the right thing had worsened the emotional harm inflicted on Miguel. Ed. The courtroom remained silent for a moment as the weight of the judge's words sank in. Miguel felt a rush of emotion, relief, validation, and justice all at once. He had fought for so long, endured the humiliation, the trauma, and the public scrutiny, but now, the truth had been recognized. As Sofia squeezed his hand, Miguel felt a surge of gratitude toward her. Without her, he might not have had the strength to fight this battle, and now, together, they had achieved something much larger than either of them had imagined. They had not only won justice for Miguel but had set a precedent for others who had been wronged in similar ways. The case was over, but the impact of their victory would last far beyond that courtroom. It was a victory not just for Miguel but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. With the truth finally revealed, they had exposed the airline's misconduct and opened the door for future accountability. And while the road to healing would take time, Miguel knew that, from this moment on, he would no longer be defined by what had happened to him on that flight. Instead, he would be remembered for standing up for justice, for himself, and for so many others. When the judge's words left his mouth, Miguel felt a wave of relief course through his entire body. Tears filled his eyes as he tried to process what he had just heard. They had won. After months of struggle, humiliation, and fear, justice had finally been served. The judge ruled that the airline was not only responsible for compensating Miguel financially for the emotional and psychological damage but also required to implement changes to its policies to prevent similar situations from happening in the future. Sofia gently squeezed Miguel's shoulder, offering a silent gesture of support. She, too, felt immense satisfaction upon hearing the verdict. She knew that this victory wasn't just for Miguel, but for all the people who had been marginalized, discriminated against, and silenced in spaces where they should have felt safe. For Sofia, this moment was confirmation that, although justice can be slow, it is possible to achieve it with perseverance and truth. Outside the courtroom, the doors opened, and a crowd of journalists and activists eagerly waited to hear the outcome. The news of the ruling spread quickly, and the support Miguel had been receiving on social media surged even more. People who had followed his story from the beginning were now celebrating this victory alongside him. Miguel's name had become a symbol of resistance and courage in the face of discrimination, and his case was seen as a catalyst for the conversation around racism in air travel and other public spaces. Miguel, still processing everything that had happened, stepped out of the courthouse with Sofia by his side. Outside, the crowd cheered and applauded. For the first time in months, Miguel allowed himself to smile freely, without fear, without the weight of uncertainty. He knew that what they had achieved wasn't just about him. His story had given a voice to many others who had suffered in silence, and now, thanks to his fight, there was tangible change on the horizon. Sofia, ever pragmatic, knew that although they had won this battle, the fight for equality and justice was a long road. There were still many challenges to face, many stories to tell, and many changes to make. But for now, she allowed herself to enjoy this moment of triumph with her nephew. She had watched him transform from a confused and hurt young man into a symbol of strength and dignity, and nothing made her prouder. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, phone calls, and congratulations. Miguel's story was everywhere, on the news, television shows, and across social media. Despite all the attention, Miguel remained grounded. He knew that his fight wasn't for fame or recognition, but for something far more important, his right to be treated as a human being with dignity and respect. And now, having achieved that, he was ready to move forward with his head held high and the conviction that, even in the darkest moments, truth and justice will always find a way to prevail. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like, share it with your friends, and comment below to let us know what you thought about this journey of perseverance and justice. And of course, watch the video that's playing on the end screen for more inspiring stories. See you next time.